In this video, I'm going to explain about pollination in general, different types of pollination, various agents which are involved in pollination. Along with that, we'll also look for some examples of pollination. The title pollination is part of chapter number 2, sexual reproduction in flowering plants. You have studied about pollination in your lower classes. You do have some idea regarding pollination. You might have also observed pollination occurring in nature. You are well aware that stamen is the male reproductive organ of flower. On the other hand, we have pistil or carpel as female reproductive organ in flower. Usually the anther of stamen releases pollen grains. Now, to explain term pollination, I would prefer to split the word or term into different words, say prefix, suffix, and root word. The root word in term pollination is pollen. Poly here refers to pollen grains which are released by anther, and the term is ending with suffix ion, which means it is a process. So pollination is a biological process wherein there is transfer of pollen grains which are released by anther onto stigma occurs. I repeat, pollination is process of transfer or movement of pollen grains released by anther onto stigma of pistil. And pollination can only occur between same species of plant. Flower of rose plant can produce pollen grains which will be successfully transferred onto flower of rose plant, and thereby fertilization and production of seeds of rose plant can occur. There is no chance of production of seeds after pollination occurring between rose flower and mango flower. To explain it, I would prefer to describe like this. Pollination is a process of transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of pistil of flowers growing on plants of same species. Usually, in order to achieve pollination, most of the plants uses external agents for pollination to occur. So external agents or pollinators are used in order to achieve pollination in most of the plants. Now, what are the importance of pollination? Is it important for plants themselves? It's obviously for flowering plants, pollination is very important. For us, for other animals, plants, and for the entire ecosystem, pollination is very important. So let's look at the importance of pollination. First of all, it's very important for the flowering plants in order to achieve pollination. In order to achieve fertilization, pollination has to occur. And after occurring fertilization, then there is production of seeds. Seeds on germination, there is production of plants. To make it simple, after occurring pollination, there is possibility of fusion of male gamete and female gametes, which is technically called as fertilization. After occurring of fertilization, then there is production of seeds. Seeds on germination, on growing and developing, then there is production of new plants. So production of new plants from seeds can occur after fertilization, and fertilization can be achieved only after pollination occurs. So pollination is very important for the plants themselves to produce seeds. And in a way, in order to produce different varieties of plants, pollination is very important. If we have different varieties of plants in our nature, then there is production of food for the herbivores. Herbivores will be later on giving food for the carnivores. And in a way, entire food chain will be stably maintained. If we have series of food chains which are stably maintained, and if the food chains are working properly, then there is interconnected food chain or food web which will be more stable. If the food web is more stable, then the ecosystem will become stable. So different varieties of plants will be helping in maintaining proper food chain, food web. So in a way, pollination will be helping in conservation or saving or preservation of biodiversity. So in order to conserve biodiversity, it's very important to have different living organism, different plants. And plants can be produced in different varieties only after pollination occurs. If we have more diverse living organism existing on earth, then it will be ensuring stability of ecosystem. So for ensuring stability of ecosystem, pollination is very important. And even for securing food for future generation and for the present generation, it's very important to have pollination. Only after achieving pollination, there is production of different varieties of crops, vegetables and fruits. If we are able to produce different varieties of crops, vegetables and fruits for this generation as well as in future generation, then we are ensuring food security. Food security can be ensured only after having sustainable agriculture or permaculture. Permanent culture agriculture can only occur if we have organic agriculture being practiced. If we could practice organic agriculture, then there'll be a sustainable agriculture, and in a way we are going to we could produce food for future generation. So pollination is important for sustainable agriculture, which in a way will be ensuring food security for present generation as well as future generation. You might have heard about news of bee as pollinators, which in a way helping in production of 1/3 of the food for the entire humanity. So pollination is very important for sustainable agriculture and for ensuring food security. So these are the importance of pollination. Now let's look at different types of pollination on the basis of source of pollen grain. We have self-pollination, which occurs within the same plant, within the flowers of same plants. On the other hand, we have cross-pollination. Cross-pollination can occur between two different plants of same species. Now let's look at the subtypes of self-pollination. Technical term used for self-pollination is autogamy. Auto refers to self. Gamy here refers to fusion or coming together. So autogamy is pollination occurring within the same flower. We have another type of self-pollination which is known as gytonogamy. Gytonogamy is pollination occurring between two flowers of same plant, two flowers growing on same plant. If pollen grains from a flower is being transferred onto another flower of the same plant, that is called as gytonogamy. If you look at the functional aspects, then it looks like cross-pollination, as there is crossing of pollen grain from one flower to another flower, but the pollination being occurring in same plant, the pollination is self-pollination. Now if you look at the genetic aspect, then being the pollen grain, as the pollen grain is transferred from the same plant, it is similar to autogamy. The gene are of the same plant, so there is production of same variety of seeds. So gytonogamy is type of pollination wherein pollen grains are transferred from one flower to another flower of the same plant. Genetically, the new plants which are produced after formation of seeds after occurring gytonogamy are genetically identical. Now, technical term for cross-pollination is xenogamy. Xenogamy is process of transfer of pollen grains from flower of a plant to flower of another plant and both the plants should be same species. So pollination occurring between two different plants of same species is called as xenogamy. Now, if you look at the xenogamy, genetical aspects of xenogamy, there is production of different plant because there is mixing of a gene of two different plants, though they are from same species. So genetically, different types of pollen grains will be landed on stigma of the plants. Now let's look at advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination. First, we'll discuss about advantages of self-pollination. Self-pollination is usually occurring within a short duration, so it is generally very fast. There is less chance of failure of pollination as the pollination is occurring within the same flower or between two flowers of the same plant. So long duration, long distance is not, there is less chance of damage of pollen grains as it has to travel for a short distance. So large number of seeds will be produced after occurring self-pollination. Plants are not completely dependent on the pollinators. So plants do not depend on external factors for pollination. Traits which are genetically identical, usually the traits produced within the flower, within the plants produced from the seeds after self-pollination are genetically identical. So if desired traits are present within the plant, it will not be lost. So traits are genetically identical and hence desired trait are not lost if self-pollination is occurring. Now let's discuss about the disadvantages of self-pollination. As it is occurring between the flower of same plant, there is no variation occurring. If there is no variation occurring, then there is no speciation happening. If there is no speciation occurring, then there is no creation of new species. So no variation occurs and there is no creation of new species if self-pollination is occurring. If there is occurrence of continuous self-pollination, then it will lead to inbreeding depression. Inbreeding depression is a problem if self-pollination occurs for, say, like 4 to 6 generations. Inbreeding depression here refers to reduction in fertility of the plant. If there is reduction, if the plant is becoming sterile, then there is no production of fertile offspring. So if there is reduction in fertility, or if the plant, the seeds produced are becoming sterile, then there is no production of fertile plants, and in a way there is reduction in productivity of the plant. If the self-pollination is occurring, then there is also a reduction in viability of the plant. The plants are later on facing problem of inbreeding depression, and they are not going to survive properly on earth. So viability here refers to ability to survive by growing and developing. So if the self-pollination is occurring, then it reduces the viability of the plant. Now let's let's discuss about the advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. First, we'll look for advantages of cross-pollination. Whenever cross-pollination is occurring, there is production of seeds in large number. Along with that, there is production of good quality seeds. If the seeds are having good quality, then on germination, there is production of healthier plant which are resistant to different external factors, resistant to different pathogens, and in a way the plant is becoming more viable. The plants will be surviving for a longer duration. Along with that, there is production of new varieties of plants if the cross-pollination is occurring. So different varieties of the plants are produced after cross-pollination occurs, mainly because of the cross-pollination is occurring between two different plants of same species. So crossing of pollen grain from one plant to another plant will be leading to formation of different variety of seeds, and in a way seeds on germination there is production of new variety or new hybrid of plant. So production of new variety of plant is one of the most advantageous benefit of cross-pollination. Now let's yes if if there is production of new variety of plants, then it will help in evolution. If a plant is undergoing evolution, then that will survive for a longer duration, as the plant is trying to adapt with the nature, as the plant is trying to make itself fit to survive in the nature. So cross-pollination will be producing new varieties of plants which in a way help in evolution, and later on the plant itself will be surviving for a longer duration. Now let's discuss about disadvantages of cross-pollination. As we have already discussed about the advantages of cross-pollination, we could draw out the disadvantages of cross-pollination. First disadvantages is there is high chance of failure of cross-pollination, as the pollen grain has to travel for long distance in order to achieve pollination. Along with that, in order to travel or transfer the pollen grain from a plant to another plant, it requires pollinator. So due to a need of pollinating agent and distance, long distance to be covered, there is high chance of failure of pollination. And along with that, there is wastage or damage of pollen grain occurs while pollination is occurring. Cross-pollination will be also introducing undesirable trait, as the pollination is occurring between two different plants. The most disadvantages of cross-pollination is cross-pollination is uneconomical for the plant. Uneconomical for the plant in the aspects that it has to produce large number of flowers, it has to produce large number of pollen grains, and the flowers should be produced in such a way that flowers should be large, should be perfumed, should be colorful, should be rich in nectar, so that insects can be attracted and cross-pollination can occur. So cross-pollination is very uneconomical for plants, as it has to sacrifice lots of energy. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. Now let's look at agents of pollination or pollinators. We have different types of pollinator in nature. It can be abiotic agents of pollination. Abiotic agents are non-living agents of pollination which are used by very few number of plants. Most of the plant usually uses biotic agents of pollination, that is animals as pollinator. Now abiotic agents of pollinator can be wind. Pollination which is occurring by wind is known as anemophily. Wind pollination is more common compared to water pollination. Water pollination is known as hydrophily, which is less common compared to wind pollination. Wind pollination is more common compared to water pollination. Now, wind pollination and water pollination is a chance factor. It may occur, may not occur. And in order to occur pollination by wind and water, flowers has to produce large number of pollen grains. Usually, wind pollinated and water pollinated flowers are not very colorful. and they are not producing nectar. Now, uh, biotic agents of pollination can be insects, mostly insects. So pollination done by insect is technically known as entomophily. There are also other animals like birds which help in pollination. Pollination which is carried by birds is known as ornithophilia. Pollination by bats is known as chiroptophilia. Pollination done by snail can be technically called as malacophily. And large animals are also involved in pollination, which can be collectively termed as zoophily. So zoophily is pollination in which animals are involved as pollinators. Now, there are some flowers, say Viola, which is commonly called as common pansy. We also have oxalis and commelina. In those flowers, there is production of two different types of flower. One flower is cleistogamous flower. Cleistogamous flower hardly opens. They are not opening flower. These flowers are not blossoming. These flowers do not expose the anther and stigma. So usually, as shown here, cleistogamous flowers are not opening. These are flower buds, and flowers are closed within the bud. Uh, on the other hand, there is production of chasmogamous flower, which are exposed or which are blossoming flower. And these blossoming flowers are having exposed anther and stigma. Now, in case of cleistogamous flower, as the anther and stigma are not exposed and they are lying very close to each other within the flower bud, so there is high chance of occurrence of self-pollination. So cleistogamous flower strictly follows autogamous pollination. That is, pollination can occur very quickly, and there is high chance of occurrence of pollination once the anther of the stamen produces pollen grains, as the anther and stigma are lying very close to each other. And in a way, after occurrence of pollination, there is 100% production of seed. So cleistogamous flowers usually produces assured seed set. There is 100% production of seeds, even without pollinators. So there are two types of flowers in case of Viola, oxalis, commelina. One type is called as cleistogamous flower and the other type is chasmogamous flower. So cleistogamous flowers usually start with Cl. That means which is very similar to close. Close is also starting with Cl. So cleistogamous flowers are closed flower and chasmogamous flowers are open flower. Flowers which usually open in Viola, oxalis and commelina. Now let's look at characteristic features of wind-pollinated flower. Wind-pollinated flowers are usually small, they lack petals, they are nectarless, they are not having bright color, and they are also not having fragrance or special odor. Many of wind-pollinated flowers are either staminate, that is male flower, or female flower, that is pistillate. So male flower or female flower, same here, male flower and female flower is present in case of wind-pollinated flower. And we do have also monoecious. Monoecious are bisexual plant. Dioecious are plants which are having separate sexes. So we have male flower, female flower. So male flower in case of Salix nigra and female flower. So wind-pollinated flowers may be pistillate or staminate. We also have bisexual flower also. So usually the pollen grains produced for wind pollination are smooth, light in weight. They are non-sticky, so that air current can transfer the pollen grain smoothly. Wind pollinated flowers usually have well exposed stamen, well exposed male reproductive organs, so that pollen grains can be easily spread or dispersed into the wind current. On the other hand, stigma of the wind pollinated flowers are also large, feathery, and well exposed, so that pollen grains which are released by anther of stamen can be trapped easily to achieve successful pollination. Most of the wind pollinated flowers usually produces single seeds, and in order to produce single seeds they should have single ovule. So wind pollinated flowers usually have single ovule. If number of flowers are present, then the number of flowers are packed in one inflorescence. As you can see here in this male flower of Salix caprea, we have number of flowers, and all these flowers are together forming one inflorescence. So one of the most common example of wind pollinated flower is cone plant. Cone flowers are usually pollinated by wind. You might have observed cone flower. So if you observe cone plants are having two flowers, male inflorescence or male flower, which is represented by tassel. Tassels are growing at the top of the cone plant, and female flower or female inflorescence is represented by the corn cob. So corn cob is having a hay-like structure growing at the tip of corn cob, and which is called as silk, and silk is having stigma and style of female inflorescence. So we have two flowers in cone plant, male flower which is represented by tassel. As you can see in this image, tassels are a male flower and it possesses stamen, and usually tassels are well exposed so that they can release the pollen grain, and pollen grain can be carried by wind easily. And on the other hand, female flowers are represented by cob, and cob is having silk, and silk is having stigma and style. Both the tassel and cob can wave in the wind as the wind blows, and in a way pollen grains are received by tiny hay-like structures called silk of corn cob, and silk of the corn cob are having stigma, and in a way pollen can be trapped easily by silk of the corn cob. We also have other examples of wind pollination, wind pollinated plants, say grasses, oak, birch, poplar, hazel, dock, cattail, plantain, papyrus, and many others. Now let's look at the pollination. Let's discuss about pollination by water. Pollination by water is technically called as hydrophilia. Pollination by water is very rare in flowering plants. We have about, say, 30 genera which follows water pollination, and mostly those flowering plants are monocotyledon. And even the distribution of water pollinated plants are very limited, mainly because of need of water for transport of male gamete and requirement of water for fertilization. So examples of water pollinated plants can be categorized as freshwater plant, for example Vallisneria and Hydrilla. We also have marine water pollinated plants For example, Zostera, a seagrass. So Zostera is a marine plant which is growing in sea. Vallisneria and Hydrilla are growing in rivers, freshwater lakes. Now, let's discuss about hypohydrophily in seagrasses. We have seen Zostera as seagrass, example of seagrass. Hypo refers to below, which technically here refers to below the water surface. Hydrophily is pollination by water. So pollination which is occurring inside the water body below the water surface. Hypohydrophily is occurring in seagrasses. So water pollinated seagrasses have female flowers which are usually submerged in water. As you can see in this image, female flowers are usually submerged inside the water body below the water surface. So female flowers are growing inside the water body, not exposed outside the water surface. Pollen grains are usually long and ribbon-like, and these are covered by mucilaginous covering. Mucilaginous covering protect the ribbon-like long pollen grains from wetting. In order to keep long ribbon-like pollen grains, mucilaginous, in order to keep the long ribbon-like pollen grains from wetting, keep it dry, then we have mucilaginous covering. So usually pollen grains are released inside the water. So male flowers are releasing pollen grains inside the water, and female flowers are also growing inside the water, below the water surface. And in a way, water current passively carries the pollen grains, which are long ribbon-like, towards the female flower, and pollination occurs by contacting the pollen grain, by interacting the pollen grain and stigma of the flower. Now we have Epihydrophilia in Vallisneria. Vallisneria is freshwater plant, and in Vallisneria, Epihydrophilia occurs. Epi refers to above. So above the water surface, if the pollination is occurring with the help of water, then that is called as Epihydrophilia. Example we have is Vallisneria. Now, female flowers of Vallisneria usually reaches the water surface by long stalks. As you can see in this cartoon, you are able to see male flower and female flower. Usually female flowers are having coiled stalk which can extend up to the water surface, and they are usually blossoming their flower on the water surface. So if the female flower is exposing out to the water surface, then stigma is also exposed outside the water body on the water surface. So usually male flowers releases pollen grains onto the surface of water. So after releasing the pollen grains onto the surface of water, pollen grains on the surface are carried by water current very slowly towards the female flower, and later on it interacts with the stigma of flower, and eventually successful pollination occurs. So in Vallisneria, Epihydrophilia occurs, pollination above the water body, that is pollination on the water surface occur. Epi means above the water surface, so above the water surface pollination is occurring in Vallisneria. That's why we are calling it as Epihydrophilia. Now, not all the aquatic plants uses water for pollination. We have water hyacinth and water lily which are using insects for pollination, and even wind for pollination. So water hyacinth and water lily are those aquatic plant. In them pollination is done either by insects and wind. So we have wide range of animals which are involved in pollination. So biotic agents of pollination can be of diverse. For example, we have bees, butterflies, beetles, wasps, ants, moths, birds which can be sunbirds and hummingbirds. Even bats can help in pollination. So these are some examples of biotic pollinators. Bees are dominant biotic pollinating agent. Bees have to be saved so that we can secure food for future generation. If we bees are being the dominant biotic pollinator, we have to save them. So we also have large animals which helps in pollination. For example, we have lemurs being as they interact with the tree, and they are having fur on their body, hair on their body, they help in pollination. We also have arboreal rodents, rat families, which are also helping in pollination. Arboreal here refers to tree dwelling. So arboreal rodents also help in pollination. We also have reptiles like gigolizard, and even garden lizards are also helping in pollination of flowers. So these are some examples of animals as pollinator. Now, what are the characteristics of flowers which are pollinated by biotic agents? But let's quickly look for the characteristic features of flowers which are pollinated by biotic agents. Majority of the animal pollinated flowers are large, colorful, fragrant, rich in nectar, mainly to attract animals. If the flowers are in a small size, then they usually have they are usually growing together to form a big inflorescence, so that the big flower will become conspicuous. Conspicuous here refers to visible, and contrasting is so visible. So if the flowers are growing in small size, they are usually growing together to make it visible for the insect pollinators. Usually beetle and fly pollinated flowers have fall order to attract mainly the flowers of the flowers which are pollinated by beetles and flies are producing fall odor in order to attract them. So these are the characteristic features of flowers which are pollinated by biotic agents of pollination. So in order to attract insects, in order to attract animal pollinators, usually flowers provide some rewards, provide some gift for the pollinators. The rewards or gift provided by flowers for the pollinator are nectar and pollen grain. Pollen grain and nectar are rich in nutrients, so that's why insects are attracted. Usually big flowers provides safe place for the insects to lay eggs. For example, we have Amorphophallus flower, which is very large, that it's about 6 feet. 6 feet, as you can see, this man standing near the Amorphophallus flower. Usually being large in size, they provide insects and animals safe place to lay their eggs. So Amorphophallus flower is an example of flowers which are providing safe place to lay eggs. We also have moth, which are provided place to lay their egg in the flower of yucca plant. Let's discuss interaction of moth and yucca plant in little detail. So moth and yucca plant. Moth usually deposits its egg in the ovarian cavity or locule of the ovary of yucca plant. After laying egg, of moth inside the ovarian cavity of yucca plant. There is also pollination done by moth to the yucca plant, as the moth will be trying to find most suitable flower to lay their egg. They has to visit different flowers. So in a way, there is transferring of pollen grains which are stick to the body of moth. And after laying egg, larvae of the moth used to come out from the floral parts after the formation of seeds. So as the seeds started developing, larvae used to come out from the egg, and in a way there is symbiotic interaction between yucca plant and moth plant, as the moth is getting place to lay their egg. Along with that, yucca plant is being pollinated. So both the yucca plant and moth can complete their life cycle by interacting among each other. So this is symbiotic interaction between moth and yucca plant. Now, what is the mechanism of pollination done by biotic agents? So suppose if we have two flowers which has to be pollinated by biotic agents, animal usually visits flowers for harvesting reward, which can be nectar or pollen grain. After coming in contact with the flower, some anthers get stick to the body of the insect. Animal get coating of sticky pollen grains. After sticking the pollen grains, the animal will visit another flower for getting more nectar, getting more pollen. So in a way, there is sticking of pollen grains which are carried by the insects onto another stigma of another flower, so which brings pollination. So this is how pollination is occurring. First, animal visitors will visit a flower. After searching, after getting while getting nectar or pollen grain, some pollen grains of the flower will be sticking onto the insects, and then insects will go to another flower, and in a way it may some of the pollen grains which are which had sticked onto the insect may be depositing on the stigma of another flower, which in a way helps in pollination. Now with this we have come to the end of this video. So you need to answer these questions. First question is you need to describe pollination in flowering plants. Second, mention some of the importance of pollination. You also have to distinguish between self-pollination and cross-pollination in flowering plants. You have to discuss about the adaptation of clistogamous flowers for self-pollination. You also have to state the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination. Sixth question demand you to write advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination, and the last question is seventh question, which need you to explain different agents of pollination. So with this, I've explained pollination, types of pollination, various agents of pollination, and some examples of pollination in brief. Hope you have understood. I'll see you in another video. Stay happy and stay safe. Take care. Bye.